I would like to invite all the speakers as well as the listeners. The session is being chaired by Professor Sharad Navre, who is a retired associate professor of physics from Shivaji University, Kolhapur. So I formally request Professor Navre to grace the chair. And I will introduce all the three speakers in the same sequence as they would be presenting their papers. And I can see that at least two of them are present here. I would like to welcome Dr. Saeeda Hamid, the former member of Planning Commission of India and former member of National Commission for Women. She's a feminist and a writer, and she also has been a vice chancellor, vice chancellor of the Maulana Azad National Urdu University. She has been honored by the government of India by its civilian honor of Padma Shri in 2007 for her contributions to the society. She's a women's rights activist, educationist, writer, and she has given valuable contribution to several areas which are linked with women, minorities, and social issues. Our second speaker is Professor Sachin Ketkar from Maharaja Sayajirao University of Badudra. He's a bilingual writer, translator, editor, blogger, and a researcher. He's worked very in depth, especially for contemporary translations from Marathi as well as Gujarati. And he's a recipient of Sahitya Akademi Award. He's translated contemporary Gujarati, numerous modern Gujarati writers like Ghulam Muhammad Sheikh, Bhupen Khakkar, Jayant Khatri, Rajendra Patel. And he has also worked on anthology of recent Marathi poetry, which was edited by him and brought out in 2005. And the third presenter for this session is a young researcher from Lahore. She's a teacher of Urdu and she loves languages. Therefore, she learned Hindi too. And she's translated some Dalit themed short stories and they are published in Aaj. She's also completed the translation of Shantaram from Hindi to Urdu. So now I request Professor Navre to chair the session and invite the speakers to present their papers in the order which I enumerated just now. Welcome all of you once again and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Should we request the first speaker, Professor Saeeda Hamid, to make her presentation? Hello, can you hear me? Hello?
Thank you. Yeah, I can hear you. Well, first of all, let me thank all my colleagues on this platform. It's a great privilege. We have a very dear common friend with Megha, who has actually introduced us. Otherwise, I've never had a chance to appear on this platform, Manisha Gupte. So here I am with my very limited knowledge, but whatever I can share with you, it's going to be something which comes from my heart. So I think the subject that you have chosen is really, very daunting subject, because it's a need of the day also. Role of literary translations to build dialogue between South Asians. And what more can we want today than to build a dialogue between South Asians? And unfortunately, that dialogue is always, it always becomes a victim of politics. So when we think of South Asia, we think of a part of our heart and soul, whether it's Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, that's where, it pulsates with us. And we can't overcome that distance. I say that with some amount of personal anguish, because I don't know, you have known me a little bit through maybe the little work that I've done with some government bodies like Planning Commission or Women's Commission. But 90% of my family in 1947 were forced to leave our hometown, which was Panipat, undivided Punjab, forced to leave and bundled into trucks and sent across the border. And now, at this point in my life, when my near and dear ones need the love and support that can come only from people who have known that history, it's not possible. It's no longer possible. So this is the reality. And I say that with knowing that there are understanding faces in front of me who can empathize with me. So role of literary translations to build dialogue between South Asians. I'm also a translator, though not as prolific or as distinguished as what I've heard from my colleague who introduced this session. My translations are always in English language. My Urdu language and English language is on par. So I think I know, and because I know Urdu, I know a little bit Farsi, I know a little bit Arabic because I read the Quran. But I don't translate the other way around. So that's my scope. I just thought I'll share that with you. Translations between languages, they create that understanding which newspapers and articles and all, those are living characters that create that understanding which translations do. And the most beautiful thing is to translate from Hindi to Urdu or Urdu to Hindi, because it's mostly transliteration and you change the vocabulary a little bit. But that is delightful. But anyway, I don't do it, so I can't claim any expertise in that. I know that we have all grown up reading European literature in translation, mostly in English. What would we have been today without Chekhov, without Tolstoy, without all the great masters of European literature we grew up with only in translation? And here, when I was growing up, actually I was quite small and I used to have access to my mother's library, where there were Urdu translations of English, French, and Russian, mostly classic novels. And also Urdu translation of Bengali novels. So my whole orientation towards translation started when I was 6 or 7 years old, going quietly and looking through my mother's library. Most of those books we are not really allowed to read them, but for very many reasons, which I'll go into later. But one of the books I remember in translation was, there was a man called Ryder Haggard, and he wrote something called She. And that was a great, great classic. He was a British writer and a great classic novel. And that was translated as Azra. And The Return of She was translated as Azra Ki Vapsi. Today, when I was putting my thoughts together for this seminar, I went into, those archives and I looked at them and I thought, my God, the world opened in front of us because of the fact that these translations existed. So my first foray into translation is my book, which Megha referred to in our conversation. And that book was published some time ago. It's called Parvaz. Parvaz literally means flight. And these are short stories of writers who wrote in Urdu. That was the common factor in these among these writers. And these were, let me just backtrack and say that in 1990, the first woman by the name of Muhammadi Begum took out the first novel, which was called Tehzeeb-e-Niswa. Tehzeeb-e-Niswa means, Tehzeeb means culture, and Niswa means women, women's culture. Now, I'm talking of 1998, Muhammadi Begum. And the same year, another woman called Akbari Begum wrote a novel called Islahun Nisa. Now, please remember the word Nisa means women. There's a surah in the Quran, which is Surah Al-Nisa, which is the surah all about the rights of women in Islam. And women have a lot of rights in Islam, but that's another story for another time. And that's one of the areas in which I have done a lot of work, women in Islam. So this novel, Islahun Nisa, which Islam means reform among the women. Now, this we're talking of that year when this was published, in which the story was of a Nawabzadi. Nawabzadi is a princess. A princess, not a sort of a very high-ranking princess, but a lot of Nawabs all over the place. Nawabzadi of Lucknow, who was learning maths and chemistry at home, 1898. So that's how far this, women's reform, women's education, that's how far it began. Now, Parvaz, this book of mine, Parvaz, which is Urdu short stories by women, we talk of borders and boundaries, right? So let me just tell you that the short stories that I have translated here, are they from India or they are from Pakistan? It's very hard to say, okay? The borders and boundaries become very blurred. The first story is by a woman whose name is Rasheed Jahan. And she was from Aligarh, from a very educated family. Her father was responsible for establishing the Women's College of Aligarh. And she created a storm because she edited a collection of short stories which completely, revolutionized women's literature. And this book by Rasheed Jahan from Aligarh, she became, by the way, the novel, the collection of short stories was called Angare. That is, Angare, Angar. It's a Marathi word also. So it had short stories about which, from the progressive writers movement, started with Rasheed Jahan. So the first story that we have done is Rasheed Jahan. Then the other next story is by a woman called Hijab Imtiaz Ali. Now she was a very modern woman, and she was writing in the early 20th century. She was the first woman pilot, and she lived in Hyderabad, but then she went to Pakistan. So her stories bordered on the fantastic. So I as a child, by the way, I was extremely fascinated with this fantasy world that she projected. The next is, okay, that's also very interesting. The next story is by a woman called Khursheed Mirza. Now, she is Rasheed Jahan's sister. So both of them very progressive, very advanced, very progressive, very educated parents. Her father was Sheikh Abdullah, not to be mistaken by the Lion of Kashmir. It was another Sheikh Abdullah who established the Women's College, and his wife was, her name was Alabi, and she was very instrumental in women's education. And she wrote wrote short stories. We included her because then she went on to join Bombay Films, and her film name was Renuka Devi. And the first film that she made was called Naya Sansar with Ashok Kumar. And Naya Sansar, the story was by my uncle, another very well-known director and writer and very well-known journalist called Khwaja Ahmad Abbas. So Naya Sansar with the story by Khwaja Ahmad Abbas with Khursheed Mirza, who had by now become Renuka Devi. So that's the other story. Then there is the story by Ismat Chugtai. Now, Ismat Chugtai, of course, is a household name, a household word. And although I did translate with a very close relative of mine, who's also a very well-known translator, Tahira Nakri. She's from originally from Pakistan, now settled in New York. And it was called The Quilt and Other Stories. And everyone reads Quilt, everyone knows Quilt, Razai, the story of Razai. So, I mean, and you know that Ismat Chughtai's whole background, that she lived in Allahabad, she lived in Aligarh, and finally joined, went to Bombay, and with her husband, Shahid Latif, they became directors, producers, and they went into the Bollywood sphere of life. And the story that we chose was for this collection was not the quilt, but it was called Genda. And Genda is Genda means this gudhal kaphool. Not gudhal. This I don't know what you call it. It's a flower which you use for puja all the time. That is Genda. And so that was the name of and it's her stories are all repressed sexualities, and that became sort of the first book about same-sex love. Became first story was Lihaf, and then it went on, and this was it. Then there was a reformist woman who wrote about women's reform, and her name was Saleha, and she used to live. I live in Jamia in Delhi, and Jamia, of course, everyone knows after what happened with the CAA and NRC and Shaheen Bagh. So I lived right next door to it, and she lived here, and she believed that stories have to have a reformist angle. And she was, from Panipat. And the next story, and another very interesting person is a woman whose name was Razia Sajjad Zahir. And her husband was I would say the highest ideologue of the progressive writers movement, Sajjad Zahir, who was known as Banne Bhai. So Banne Bhai and Razia Appa, they were, another generation and all, but that's how we used to call them. She wrote this delightful story called Langdi Mumani. Langdi Mumani is an aunt who's lame, and she stands up for women's rights. And I'll quickly go through the others. But I don't want to spend, spend all the time in describing my parvaz. I don't even think this book is any time available now. But these were writers who were from Lucknow, went to Pakistan. They were from Badaयूं in UP, went to Pakistan. They were from Hyderabad, they went to Pakistan. So, this is what literature is. I mean, what can you say? Borders and boundaries become very soft, and more or less, we have to contend with them. And literature, expands beyond borders and boundaries. But the last person I want to talk about is a woman called Qurratul Ain Haider. She was Saitya, she lived in Bombay, she lived in Aligarh, she lived in London, she lived in Delhi, she lived in Karachi. She was everywhere. And a winner of Sahitya Academy Award. one of the, I remember her so well, in so much a part of my life, that, and she and Ismat Appa were like polarities. Ismat Chughtai very earthy, and Qurratullah and Haider very elitist, but with total control of her idiom. And her books have been translated into so many languages. Her books, like about at least a dozen novels, a dozen collection of short stories translated in so many languages. And by the way, before I forget, my colleague told me, as when I was preparing for this, she said, please tell them that your Parvaz was translated into Japanese. Well, I had completely forgotten that, but now when she reminded me that, I thought, yes, that's true. So that is one part of my work in translation. And I think that some of these, and now I'm talking none of these women are, except I think one of them, Jilani Bano, I have included Jilani Bano in this collection, and her story is called Bin Bulai Mehman, which means those guests that you don't call, they just drop in. So she's the only one who's living. All of them have passed away. So, and then there is a whole bunch of new women writers who are now writing. And about a couple of months ago, I was invited to launch 5 books of 4 writers who were write for today. They were writing today. And so that also, for another session, another time. But since this is my work, I thought I'll share it with you. And then I want to just share one more work of mine with you, which is, I think, a very important translation, and which needs to be translated in many, many languages. And this is, like Megha is an expert in Russian. So here is a book which is written by a man called Altaf Hussain Hali. And he lived in Panipat. And he was the first feminist poet of this entire South Asia. He wrote about women, he wrote about the right, and all in poetry, mind you, the rights of women, how the deprivation of women, the oppression of women. And he wrote, he was such an ardent supporter of women's rights. And he was also a Maulana. So he was called Maulana Altaf Hussain Hali, and nobody could stand against him, because he was, how could anyone say anything to a Maulana when he was talking about the rights of women? And I'll quote you one little verse from Hali, which will give you the sense. He says, he addresses the women, and look at the irony in his poetry. He says, and I'm going to say it in Urdu and translate it for you, Jab tak raho tum ilmo danish se raho mehroom ya. Meaning, till you are alive, you're not educated. Jab tak raho tum ilmo danish se raho mehroom ya, jaisi thi aayi bekhabar, waise hi jao bekhabar. You came ignorant and you go ignorant from here. Jab tak raho tum ilmo danish se raho mehroom ya, jaisi thi aayi bekhabar, waise hi jao bekhabar. जो इल्म मर्दों के लिए समझा गया आबे हयात. For men, education was considered an elixir of life. जो इल्म मर्दों के लिए समझा गया आबे हयात, ठहरा तुम्हारे हक में वो ज़हरे हलाहल सर बसर. For you it was considered poison. For men, education was the elixir, and for you it is poison. जो इल्म मर्दों के लिए समझा गया आबे हयात, ठहरा तुम्हारे हक में वो ज़हरे हलाहल सर बसर. आता है वक्त इंसाफ का. The time has come for justice. आता है वक्त इंसाफ का. नजदीक है यौमुल हिसाब. The day of judgment is coming. The day of judgment is coming, and this is the time of reckoning. आता है वक्त इंसाफ का. नजदीक है यौमुल हिसाब. मर्दों को देना होगा इन हक तलफियों का वहाँ जवाब. Men have deprived you of right, and they will have to speak, and they will have to answer for this deprivation when the day of judgment comes. आता है वक्त इंसाफ का, नजदीक है यौमुल हिसाब, मर्दों को देना होगा इन हक तलफियों का वहां जवाब. Now, why can't these things be translated? I mean, Marathi is the most beautiful language. I know because my uncle was a great, Khaja Ahmad Abbas lived, with a completely Marathi ethos. So I know it without actually. So, and the other thing that, three things Hali stood for, and I want to just sum up my remarks by talking about Hali, and in the end, I'll quote one little piece of poetry from a friend who's writing now, like he wrote it very recently, and I promised him that this is very relevant, so I'll quote you. Anyway, the second subject that Hali believed in was that this country's future, this country's prosperity, this country's sustenance depends on Hindu-Muslim unity. Hindu-Muslim ittihad, Hindu-Muslim ittihad. और आप लोगों के यहाँ तो हिंदू मुस्लिम इत्तेहाद की बहुत बात होती है, जहाँ से आप, जिस यूनिवर्सिटी से आप इस वक्त जहाँ प्रेजेंट कर रहे हैं. सो हिंदू मुस्लिम इत्तेहाद, he believed in it, he talked about it, and he said it is the duty, your religious duty, to have Hindu-Muslim unity to get, the country has to be rise to freedom. And 1905 he wrote this, and I'll again quote from Hali. तुम अगर चाहते हो, this is very simple, तुम अगर चाहते हो मुल्क की खैर, तुम अगर चाहते हो मुल्क की खैर, न किसी हम वतन को समझो गैर, हो मुसलमान उसमें या हिंदू. तुम अगर चाहते हो मुल्क की खैर, न किसी हम वतन को समझो गैर, हो मुसलमान उसमें या हिंदू, बौद्ध मजहब हो या हो सिख बंधु, सबको मीठी निगाह से देखो, सबको मीठी निगाह से देखो, समझो आंखों की पुतलियां सबको. They are the pupils of your eye. पुतली means the pupil. सबको मीठी निगाह से देखो, समझो आंखों की पुतलियां सबको. And then he says, मुल्क है इत्तेफाक से आबाद. The country is prosperous because we have ittifaq. We have a sort of a bhai behan chara. I can't find another word for it. मुल्क है इत्तिफाक से आबाद, कौम है इल्तिफात से आजाद. इल्तिफात means लुत्फ, love. आजाद हैं because हमारे पास प्यार है. कौम है इत्तिफाक से आबाद, मुल्क है इल्तिफात से आजाद. मुल्क में इत्तिफाक होता अगर, मुल्क में इत्तिफाक होता अगर, खाते गैरों की ठोकरें क्यों कर? Question mark. Because we let go of Hindu-Muslim ittihad, इसीलिए हमको गैरों ने ठोकरें लगाई हैं. We have been beaten up by strangers. So this was the other point that is important. Why Hali needs to be. I did a verse translation of his most important poem. It's a long poem. It is a poem of, I think, 290 I don't know what you call them, cantos. I mean, 6 lines, and it's called Musaddas-e-Hali. Musaddas means simply a 6-line stanza. It's a technical word. Okay, so this is the book that I have done, and it's called Musaddas-e-Hali, and it is a verse translation of his book on reform in Islam. Reform in Islam, the very reform because of which Islam today is the most badname zabana religion in the world. Anti-women, anti-peace, every noble quality, and Islam militates against it. And Hali wrote this 290 Musaddas verses on reform in Islam. And I translated them, and I remember when I was doing this, I was talking to Mr. Khushwant Singh, who was a very good friend of mine and inspired me a lot. And I said to him, I cannot possibly translate it in English verse. I mean, I'm just going mad thinking, how am I going to rhyme the end words. And he said to me one thing, and I want to share it with you, my dear friends. And he said, if I can translate Allama Iqbal's Shikwa Jawab-e Shikwa. Allama Iqbal wrote a long poem in which it was a complaint to Allah, and Allah answers the complaint of human beings. Shikwa means complaint. And it was called Shikwa, and the answer of Allah was Jawab-e Shikwa. So he said, if I can translate Iqbal into verse, why can't you translate Hali into verse? So because of his inspiration and not even his prodding me continuously, then I was able to do this Musaddas-e-Hali, and it is called A Story in Verse of Ebb and Tide of Islam. Islam degenerated because of what the Muslims did to Islam. So this is, and again, a Maulana doing this, who could ever say anything? And I'm told, I've read accounts that when there were big mehfils in which Musaddas was recited and sometimes sung, people used to cry and weep because they said, what have we done? What have we done? So these are like gems. They bring our consciousness to the fore. They bring मुल्कों को इकट्ठा लाते हैं, South Asia को इकट्ठा लाते, because our, the problems, just flow easily एक दूसरे के साथ. The problems are very common. And I have to end now, and I want to end with a friend of mine who, a young man whose name is Ankush Gupta, and he calls himself Ankush Gupta Siraj. Now, all poets, have a poetic name, and in Urdu we call it takhallus. So I asked him, I said, Ankush, what is your takhallus? He said, Siraj. And he went to Pakistan in 2013. And by the way, before I say this, I have to tell you also that last night I got this little video clip, and guess what? Shafqat Amanat Ali singing Vaishnav Jan. Beautiful, beautiful. Shafqat Amanat Ali Khan in Pakistan singing Vaishnav Jan to Taini Kaye Peer Parai Jane Re. So to me, that is South Asia. That is South Asia, which I'm sure that's this kind of a gathering is going to give us some ideas. And Ankush went there in 2013, and he wrote these 5-6 lines, and that's the last thing I'll say. मेरे और तुम्हारे और मेरे घर के बीच एक दीवार खड़ी है. तुम्हारे और मेरे घर के बीच एक दीवार खड़ी है, जो संग दिली के पत्थर और स्वार्थ की मिट्टी और आंसू और खून के पानी और रिश्तों के मलबे से बनाई गई है. So this wall that is standing between your house and mine, it is made out of संग दिली के पत्थर, स्वार्थ की मिट्टी, आंसू और खून के पानी और रिश्ते के मलबे से ये दीवार बनाई गई है. And then he says, लोग कहते हैं कि हमारे बीच में ये दीवार नहीं थी, सिर्फ एक खुला आंगन था जहां हमारी पीढ़ियां साथ वक्त गुजारा करती थी. किस्सा गोइयों पर हंसते थे, stories, we were laughing. किस्सा गोइयों पर कहे लगाते थे, जाड़े में नर्म धूप सेंकी जाती थी और एक दूसरे के आंसू पोंछे जाते थे. We used to wipe each other's tears. And the last line he says, फिर एक दीवार बन गई. एक दूसरे का चेहरा नहीं देख सकते. जाड़े की नर्म धूप दोनों का आंगन सेंकती है. Both आंगन्स are lit up by the winter sun. और एक की आंखों, and this is such a beautiful line, और एक की आंखों की नमी दूसरे की दीवार सील जाती है. If I cry, your wall gets water in it. और दीवार के उस तरफ जब कोई दुआ के लिए हाथ उठाता है तो दूसरी तरफ से आवाज आती है, आमीन. Very simple, very evocative, And anyone who says that Urdu is a language of Muslims and it's a Muslim language and this and all of that, what is going on, I mean, you see the languages, there is absolutely no barriers. It is equally the language of Anand Narayan Mullah. It is the language of Raghupati Sahai Firaq Gorakhpuri. It is the language of Jagannath Azad. It is the language of the most revered Kashmiri poet called Brij Narayan Chakbast. This is everybody's language. And that is why language and translation, they transcend borders and boundaries. So thank you very much. I will put a stop here and look forward to the rest of this session. Thank you.
Anagha, that was an excellent speech.
Hello, Vineet. Nice to see you.
Thank you, Tahira Nakri.
Anagha.
Excellent speech it was. Thank you.
Okay. So I think
Next speaker, I invite Mr. Sachin Ketkar. Kindly make your presentation.
Thank you very much for having me here. I want to congratulate first of all the organizers of this very crucial and seminar at a very critical time, where South Asia as a region, I think, is being beset by all kinds of bigotry, and in this situation of crisis that we are discussing, the dynamics of South Asia. And one of the most important aspect of a dialogue or a kind of space where we can exchange, or a platform for exchange, would be translation. And as my area is translation, my focus is not going to be so much upon how to translate or my own experiences as translators, but looking at the growing body of translated texts from South Asia and entering academia, of course. We need to look at what are the ways in which we can read and understand these texts, especially when the first languages are not the languages that we understand. For example, if we are to read Lihaf in Kerala, for example, or if we are to read Bashir in Pakistan, through English. So English becomes a space where we exchange and share. But in order to read and understand these translated texts, I think we need to take a closer look at this growing archive of Indian and South Asian literature in English translation. So my focus is going to be more upon reading, analyzing, and looking at the contexts of translations into English. That's the focus of my presentation. And I just want to just allude to what Saida Hamid ma'am says about Urdu being a Muslim language. And when we think of English, we don't ever call it a Christian language, which is very funny. Means how languages and religious identities are conflated for political purposes becomes a problem, because we use one standard for one language and we don't use the same standard for other. And English is the language that I think in South Asia, one of the most sought after languages is English. So I'm going to talk about English, and the whole asymmetric context of English translation and reception is going to be my focus. So if I'm allowed to share my screen for PPT, can I do that? I don't know if I'm visible. Okay, just share my screen. Is my screen visible now?
yes.
Yeah. So the topic is World Englishes, and I would like to draw your attention to the plural use here: World Literature and Globalization, Asymmetric Context of Translation in South Asia. And we are looking at a contemporary temporal phase after 80s and late 80s and 90s, where there is an expansive growth in processes of globalization. But along with this process, we also see the rise of new conceptualizations to think about literatures and languages. And one of such conceptualizations is the idea of world Englishes in plural. Along with that, the idea of world literature is also something that has been debated, discussed, and rethought in several ways in the era of globalization, especially after the fall of Berlin Wall. And it is in the same period that translation studies has seen an expansive growth. So what are the convergences between these three ideas of translation, world Englishes, and world literature is something that I'm going to think about. And I've just started thinking about this topic, so I'm just scratching the surface. But I'm sure it might, your inputs from distinguished audience and scholars and translators will be of great help for me to develop these ideas further. And what and how I plan to go about it is by I am going to critically engage with Vinay Dharwarkar's theory and practice of translation into English, being a very important theorist and a translator that he is, and try to map several asymmetric contexts of translation ecology in South Asian context in order to explore convergences and disjunctures in conceptualization of world Englishes, world literature, and translation. What I will do, as I'm aware that we are in Kolhapur, and one of the most renowned poets from Kolhapur would be Arun Kolatkar. And so I will just begin by reading out a small poem by Arun Kolatkar in Marathi and look at the two translations to start with, done by two different people, which will provide a kind of ground or the archive which we are trying to understand through certain theoretical conceptualization. And the poem is very well known, so I'm sure some of you may be already aware of it, but even then, this is a very famous poem called Takta, which belongs to the Abecedarian genre, where alphabet is used as lines of the poems. So, Takta, ananas, आई, इजार, इडलिंबू, उखळ, ऊस आणि एडका सगळे आपापले चौकोन सांभाळून बसलेत. एरण, ओंडवा, औषध आणि आंबा, कप, खटारा, गणपती आणि घर सगळ्यांच्या स्वतःच्या मालकीच्या जागा आहेत. चमचा, छत्री, जहाज आणि जबलं, टरबूज, ठसा, डबा, ढग आणि बाण सगळे आपापले जागे ठाण मांडून बसलेत. तलवार, थडग, दौत, धनुष आणि नळ, पतंग, फणस, बदक, भटजी आणि मका यांचा एकमेकांना उपद्रव होण्याची शक्यता नाही. यज्ञ, रथ, लसूण, वजन आणि शहामृग, षटकोण, ससा, हरिण, कमळ आणि क्षत्रिय या सगळ्यांनाच अढळपद मिळालंय. बाई बाळाला उखळात घालणार नाही, भटजी बदकाला लसणाची फोडणी देणार नाही, टरबुजाला थळकून जहाज दुभंगणार नाही. शहामृग जोपर्यंत जबलं खात नाही तोपर्यंत क्षत्रिय पण गणपतीच्या पोटात बाण मारणार नाही. आणि हेडक्यानं ओंडव्याला टक्कर दिली नाही तर ओंडव्याला थडग्यावर कप फोडायची काय गरज आहे. So this is the poem, and it uses this Marathi alphabet chart. And let's look at two English translations for those who don't understand it, because our discussion is going to be around these poems. So pictures, and this is the first translation. Pictures from a Marathi alphabet chart. Pineapple, mother, pants, lemon, mortar, sugarcane, ram. How secure they look, each ensconced in its own separate square. Mango, anvil, cup, Ganapati, cart, house, medicine bottle, man touching his toes. All very comfortable. They all know exactly where they belong. spoon, umbrella, ship, frog, watermelon, rubber stamp, box, cloud, arrow. Each one of them seems to have found its special niche, a sinecure. Sword, inkwell, tombstone, longbow, water tap, kite, jackfruit, Brahmin, duck, maize. Their job is to go on being themselves, and their appointment is for life. Yagna, chariot, garlic, ostrich, hexagon, rabbit, deer, lotus, archer. No, you don't have to worry. There is going to be no trouble in this peaceable kingdom. The mother will not pound the baby with a pestle. The Brahmin will not fry the duck in garlic. That ship will not crash against the watermelon. If the ostrich won't eat the child's frog. The archer won't shoot an arrow in Ganpati's stomach. And as long as the ram persists, the impulse of butting him from behind, what possible reason could man touching his toes have to smash the cup on the tombstone? So this is the first translation. And I'm deliberately not telling you the names of the translators. The second translation of the same poem is titled Alphabet. So you can see the difference even in the titles. Anvil, arrow, bow, box, and Brahmin, cart, chariot, cloud, and compost heap are all sitting in their separate squares. Corn, cup, deer, duck, and frog, Ganesh, garlic, hexagon, and house all have places of their own. Inkpot, jackfruit, kite, lemon, and lotus, mango, medicine, mother, old man, and ostrich are all holding their proper positions. Pajamas, pineapple, rabbit, and ram, sacrifice, seal, spoon, and sugarcane won't interfere with each other. Sword, tap, tombstone, and umbrella. Warrior, watermelon, weight, and yacht have all found their eternal resting place. The mother won't put their baby on the compost heap. The Brahmin won't season the duck with garlic. The yacht won't hit the watermelon and sink. Unless the ostrich eats the baby's frog, the warrior won't shoot an arrow into Ganesha's belly. And if the ram doesn't knock down the old man, why would he need to smash the cup on the tombstone? I leave that to you to figure out which is a better translation of this, because anyway, even if we think of which is better translation and why, you can see the difference between the two translations. The Marathi poem is using Marathi alphabet chart. The first translation retains this Marathi Marathi alphabet chart schema, right? While the second translation uses the English alphabet chart schema, anvil, arrow, bow, box, and Brahmin. So there is a kind of recasting of Marathi alphabet chart into English in the second translation. The first translation retains this Marathi schema. Now, the question would be, which translation would be more acceptable in which space and why? And these are the questions that we are going to think about. The second translation, incidentally, is by a well-known scholar named Vinay Dharwadkar. The first translation is by the poet himself. One of the ways of thinking about South Asian literatures in English translation is through the idea of what is known as world literature. And the notion of world literature has been around from 19th century, as long as probably the discipline of comparative studies was formulated. But it was the thinking about the whole notion of world literature was reinvigorated with the collapse of the Berlin Wall. The traditional meaning of world literature was more of qualitative one or quantitative one, by which I mean that it's kind of masterpieces of world literature. We mentioned Chekhov and we mentioned so many other canonical writers. So one understanding of the term world literature is canonical one. The other one was largely quantitative one, as a kind of sum total of all literatures in the world. However, both these ways of understanding world literature were critiqued, and different models were brought out in the 90s and the beginning of 20th century, especially because of people like Pascal Casanova, Franco Moretti, and David Damrosch. They both tried to dislodge this conventional, traditional understanding of world literature. And for David Damrosch, all literary texts that circulate outside their origin, culture of origin, become world literature. So Kabir would be world literature, and Tagore would be world literature. And you can see that there is a space for anti-canonical formulations possible when we look at those texts which circulate outside the culture of origin. So Kolhatkar's both poems in English versions are part of world literature because they occupy spaces which are no longer in the context of Marathi. So instead of looking at world literature as an infinite, ungraspable canon, Damrosch insists on looking at the modes of circulation. Yeah, so you can see that translation becomes a mode of circulation, something which makes world literature possible in first place. It's a condition for world literature. Another very important formulation of world literature is by Franco Moretti, who says that literature today is a planetary system. And when we say planetary system, Lihaf can be as much studied in Bangladesh as in Sri Lanka, as in Pakistan, as in India, and so on. So when a translated text occupies transnational space, especially when it is English. And what Moretti goes on to argue is that we have to understand this space as using the World System School of Economic History by Wallerstein. And he insists on looking at it as a unitary and unequal space. Now, this unequal is extremely important because there is a distinction between core and periphery of this global system of literature. What Pascal Casanova calls World Republic of Letters is unequal. Its centers are still very much Europe and America, and its peripheries would be our South Asian spaces, social and cultural spaces. And as Professor Devi was pointing out yesterday, almost 25% of population is in this space called South Asia. And yet we are at the peripheries of a world literary system. So in this light, the South Asian literatures in translation can be viewed as occupying peripheral space of world literature. So both poems in English circulate outside the culture of origin. So this is one way of thinking about South Asian literature in English translation. I'm going to look at some other ideas which one of the translators of Kolhatkar poem, the second one, and try to understand his theory of translation as well in a nutshell. And he lays down the first, he talks about 10 principles of translation. And he says that translating in the millennium, Indian literature in the world market, in the global market. So we are looking at global markets here. And his first principle is that we should rigorously conform to international standards of translation and publication. In a global economy, Dharavadkar says, we cannot predict where a book will find its reader at home or abroad. The audience of Indian and by extension South Asian literary works in translation is now scattered worldwide and includes Indian, South Asian diasporic Indians, and there are a substantial number of South Asians in the world, and non-Indians of every variety interested in India. Our representations of Indian literature will succeed in global marketplace only if they conform to these international standards of production and form. So what he is actually saying is a widely held commonsensical assumption about politics of Indian and South Asian literatures in English translation. And he goes on to add, we ought to render our text consistently into international standard English and not Indian English. And this is where I think the problem starts cropping up with the first principle that Dharwadkar lays out. Because if you look at the first translation of the Kolhapur poem, done by the poet himself, where he's trying to, as if, Marathify English language, because the poem itself is about language as a world of language as a way of looking at the world, as if each language has its own worldview, which is encapsulated by this alphabet chart that he's talking about. So language and the world have their own ways of modeling and mapping. So each language models and maps the world in its own way. So the Kolhapur's own strategy of translation, it seems, is to Marathi-size English by making English conform to Marathi alphabet chart. While Dharwadkar's own practice seems to be transforming Marathi worldview to suit or fit into the Anglophone worldview, by transforming the Marathi alphabet chart into English alphabet. So even if you look at the titles of the poems, they themselves mark the difference between the strategies of translations that we have just seen. And he goes on to talk about world literature like Aeschylus and Dante and Flaubert and Dostoevsky and so on, Neruda and Marquez, Pamuk. And he says that many of our classics do not conform to these global standards of English. And that's why there is some sort of failure of South Asian literatures in English translation to find place in the global literary system, global world literature. So, and then just as an extension of what I'm saying about Dharwadkar, he goes on in his 8th principle is very interesting, where he says that translator's job is to translate text and its readers simultaneously. And he is drawing upon A.K. Ramanujan's famous statement that one translates not just the text but also the reader. So he says that literary translation should carry over a text from one language to another, which he is not doing. What he is doing, he is trying to transform Marathi worldview and make it conform to the Anglophone worldview in order to maybe pitch South Asian literatures at a global marketplace. But his own 8th principle says exactly the opposite. He is saying that the reader, who may be in the central or the core regions of Anglophone world, like native speakers, which I'm going to just talk about briefly as we proceed, and then you have to bring South Asian text to the reader, while his 8th principle says it's the other way around. So there is some tension between his own principles, which are almost paradoxical as we go along when we start looking at his own formulations of these principles. And then his 5th principle is also very interesting. He is that translation should convey the original's diction, style, voice, and tone as precisely as possible. Now, is it possible to have diction, style, voice, and tone independent of language? Means when we talk of Ismet Chugtai, her own view, her diction, her style, her voice is deeply embedded in the language that she is using. So when you want to bring out that in translation, then you have to go away from what he has said as the international standards of English, of international English. Plus, I also feel skeptical whether there are any spelled out canonical fixed international standards of international English, which even the native speakers themselves use. because the language being a very fluid and dynamic entity, the native speakers would as much flaunt the norms of standard English as say, for example, the users of standard Marathi. Nobody speaks standard Marathi in Maharashtra, right? In same way, I don't think there are any standard language speakers at all. Does that even exist, except on BBC, or maybe even not in BBC any longer, with multicultural news readers being part of BBC. So whole idea of international standards to which your translation should rigorously conform becomes a problem, because they are not spelled out. And secondly, they are not even fixed. At the same time, so many post-colonial writers, by which we mean Anglophone writers, which is in my view, a very problematic idea, because Ismat Chugta is as much post-colonial as Rushdie, but we don't think on those lines. Have this liberty of chutnification of English, as Rushdie would use mongrel hybrid English. And I have a feeling that it's used more for exoticization for the Anglophone market. So are there any other ways of thinking about this whole question of English? Is the last point that I'm trying to make here. And this is based on the notion of world Englishes as developed by Braj Kachru. So South Asian literatures in English, translations especially, are to be understood as belonging to world Englishes. And what do we mean by world Englishes? Then Braj Kachru says that there is no such thing like single English, which is in contrast to what Dharwadkar is saying, because English has become a global language, but at the same time, functionally and in terms of form as well, it has diversified. It has become polycentric, pluricentric. And he tries to critique this notion of globalization of English as a success story of singular monocultural Western language by highlighting in terms of functional pragmatism, especially that of multiple canonicity in Englishes, British, North American, African, and Asian languages. In other words, Kachru states that what we need is a conceptualization of world English in a framework of pluricentricity and a distinctive cultural formation. So while Dharwadkar seems to be saying that we should conform to the norms of Anglophone native speaker variety of English, Kachru is talking about distinctiveness of various kinds of Englishes used in the peripheries as well as in South Asia. And he says that the term international used with English is misleading in more than one sense. It signals an international English in terms of acceptance, proficiency, functions, norms, pragmatic utility, and creativity. This is actually far from true. This is not the current international functional profile of English language, and never was. We just have to turn on our English news channels to hear the fact that it is not the Anglophone variety of English that you hear. It's Indian and South Asian varieties that you hear on the news channels. So he provides an alternative conceptualizations in this very famous diagram called the 3 circles of English, where the first circle, according to Kachru, consists of mostly the so-called native speakers of English. He uses the term first diaspora, which is very accurate. It means English as it spread to USA, Canada, Australia, where it's mostly the first language. That's the inner circle. The outer circle would consist of South Asian varieties of English, as well as the ex-colonies, where English has become second and very important language. And that includes places like Hong Kong, Bangladesh, Ghana, India, Kenya, Malaysia, Nigeria, Pakistan, Philippines, Singapore, Sri Lanka, Zambia. So Africa and South Asia, these peripheral spaces of world literary system, belong to the outer circle, the second circle of world Englishes, according to Kachru. And the third is the expanding circle. Means English is now spreading into those regions where it was not first language, nor were these places colonized, like China, Egypt, Indonesia, Israel, Japan, Korea, Nepal, Saudi Arabia, Taiwan, Russia, Zimbabwe. So you can see that English is a growing phenomena, but it is pluricentric. However, the norms of canonicity, or what constitutes as good English or standard English, come from the inner circle and in some ways still are hegemonic in the outer circle. In theory, however, in practice, I am using an English which is not the first circle variety of English. So Braj Kachru is trying to draw attention at multicentrality of English, the multiplicity of Englishes in the world today, rather than saying that it's the one language that exists even in China and Pakistan. These are two different languages. Chinese English would be different from Pakistani English, would be different from Indian varieties of English, and so on and so forth. And this polycentricity and polycanonicity is something that we should start acknowledging as translators as well. If we can accept Indian English or South Asian English or for our news channels and newspapers, there is no reason why we should not be accepting this as a canon for translation, as a standard. So instead of following Dharwadkar's first principle, I think we should now try to reformulate, rethink what are our norms and standards for translation. And the last point I will just talk about in a nutshell and stop is how do we then go about mapping this asymmetrical translational ecology in South Asia. And I'm going to use Professor Devi's term bhasha. Vernacular is also acceptable to me. Translation from English to bhasha or English to vernacular occupies more privileged space compared to translation between bhashas. So translation from Urdu to Hindi, Hindi to Urdu, or Bangla to Odia, or Odia to Gujarati occupy asymmetrically lower space compared to translation from English to bhasha, which means that it is more privileged and hegemonic model of translation in South Asia. Within English bhasha translation, there is still yet more asymmetry. Translation from English into bhasha occupies far more privileged space, hegemonic space compared to bhasha to English. So there is a greater traffic of text from English to South Asian languages rather than from other way around happening. So there is fewer number of Indian or Urdu literary texts or Gujarati literary texts going into English compared to English text coming into Gujarati or Urdu. Within that, there is yet more asymmetry when native Anglophone translators who are based, whose first language is English, occupy the South Asian studies centers in Europe or America, have greater privilege and visibility compared to non-native translators. Maybe, and this is the problem that we should think about, which is not to undermine. I'm not going to rant against it as neo-Orientalism because I don't believe that's so. But native Anglophone translators have done to Marquez or Pamuk. So what? So while in South Asia, it's South Asians who are translating South Asians most of the time, and that is an asymmetry or an inequality. Translation between bhashas have still more inequality built into it. Means translation from Bangla and Hindi have greater space and visibility compared to, say, for example, Gujarati, Marathi, and Punjabi, for example. So there are minor South Asian languages as well as major South Asian languages, which is a kind of inequality. And finally, the generic inequality, in the sense that popular literature gets translated into regional languages more than the literary text. So these are some of the asymmetries and which are reflected in the flows of translation in this world literary space of globalization. And with this, I want to actually end my presentation, opening up these questions, and your inputs, critical suggestions would help me to formulate my argument further as we move along. So I want to end by again thanking the organizer and Professor Pansare in particular for having me here in this very important seminar. Thank you.
Thank you, Sachin. It was an extremely interesting theory that you have put forth. And let me see how our participants they react to it. We'll of course go for questions and answers at the end of the session. But meanwhile, please, you can write down them.
Yeah.
Let us call the next speaker. Who's that? Parva Shafakat, who has translated. Hello? Yes? Yeah. Miss Parva is there?
Yes, she's there. I see her.
The next speaker, please. Miss Parva Shafkat. Is there?
Parva, you need to unmute yourself, I think.
She's doing that.
Yeah.
Hello, Sahil. Can you unmute her? Can you help her?
आदाब।
Yeah.
नमस्कार सबको, मेरा सलाम। मैं काफी देर से अनम्यूट करने की कोशिश कर रही थी लेकिन हो नहीं पा रहा था होस्ट की तरफ से। मैं इस सेशन को अटेंड कर रही हूँ एंड इट्स हाईली प्लेजरेबल टू लिसन ऑल ऑफ यू। आप तो सब बहुत एक्सपीरियंस के साथ और बहुत तजुर्बे के साथ और बहुत मुशाहिदे के साथ बोल रहे हैं। आई एम क्वाइट यंग इन दिस प्लेग्राउंड बट स्टिल I can share my experiences and my observation. सबसे पहले तो मैं दोनों यूनिवर्सिटीज़ का शुक्रिया अदा करूँगी कि इतने अनसर्टन टाइम्स में, जबकि पूरी दुनिया जो है कोविड की लपेट में भी है और पूरी दुनिया जो है नफरतों का भी सामना कर रही है, they are just bridging the gulf between the nations, South Asian nations. तो मैं दोनों यूनिवर्सिटीज़ और इनके मौजूदीन का शुक्रिया अदा करूँगी। वैसे तो मैंने देखा है कि सारे इंग्लिश में बात कर रहे थे, मैंने स्पेसिफिकली ख़ास तौर पे उर्दू और हिंदी का मिक्सचर जो है वो चुना है बोलने के लिए, ताकि इसकी भी नुमाइंदगी हो जाए जो हमारी अपनी नेटिव लैंग्वेजेस हैं। मेरा जो उन्वान है, जो मेरी चर्चा का मौजू है, वो कोई अदक मौजू नहीं है, कोई इल्मी बहस नहीं है, कोई जो है कॉम्प्लेक्स किस्म का इज़म नहीं है। मैं चाहती हूँ कि मैं अभी जो रिसेंट में जिस तजुर्बे से गुजरी हूँ उसको आप सबके साथ जो है वो शेयर कर सकूँ, आप सबको बता सकूँ कि मैंने अभी रिसेंटली जो है शांतारामा जी की आत्मकथा है शांतारामा, उस पे काम किया है। तो उसका अनुवाद मैंने हिंदी से उर्दू में किया है। तो कोल्हापुर से उनका ताल्लुक है। कोल्हापुर जो है मेरे लिए बहुत इम्पोर्टेंट शहर है। जैसे मुझे अजमल कमाल साहब ने बताया कि कॉन्फ्रेंस हो रही है, डॉक्टर मेघा के बारे में बताया, तो मैंने फौरन हाँ कर दी। हालांकि मैं जानती हूँ कि मैं आप सबके मुकाबले में बहुत बहुत ज्यादा जो है अभी कम उम्र भी हूँ, और मतलब पढ़ाई के लिहाज से और इन सारे कामों के लिहाज से, लेकिन फिर भी मैं चाहती थी कि मैं आप सबसे बात करूं और देखूं कि ये कोल्हापुर के वासी कैसे हैं, और अपने अब आप तक अपना प्यार पहुंचा सकूं। तो वी शांतारामा जी जो हैं वो साउथ एशियन, आपको पता है कि जो हमारा सिनेमा है उसका एक अटूट अंग है। अगर हम उन्हें कहें कि वो पायनियर्स में से हैं, वो अव्वलीन उन लोगों में से हैं जिन्होंने इंडियन सिनेमा को अपनी संतान समझते हुए परवान चढ़ाया, उसकी नशोनुमा की, तो ये गलत नहीं होगा। वो प्रोड्यूसर भी हैं, वो डायरेक्टर भी हैं, वो राइटर भी हैं, वो एक्टर भी हैं, और उन्होंने नित नए तजर्बात करने में भी कोई कसर नहीं उठा रखी। जनवरी 2018 में मुझे अजमल साहब ने, जो पाकिस्तान के जाने माने अखबार रिसाले आज के मुदीर हैं, एडिटर हैं, उन्होंने मुझसे राब्ता किया और उन्होंने कहा कि वी शांताराम साहब की जो है ये बायोग्राफी है कि तुम इसको ट्रांसलेट करना चाहोगी, क्योंकि वो जानते थे कि मुझे हिंदी आती है, मैंने हिंदी पढ़ रखी है, बाकायदा सीखी है, कुछ लिख पढ़ भी लेती हूँ। तो उन्होंने जब मुझे काम सौंपा तो मैंने झट से उनका नाम सुनते हुए जो है इस काम को कबूल कर लिया। हम साउथ एशियन जो हैं, जनूबी एशिया के जो लोग हैं, हमारा ताल्लुक सिनेमा से बहुत गहरा है। हम दो चीज़ों के साथ बहुत जज़्बाती लगाव रखते हैं, एक शायरी, एक सिनेमा। जब हम आपस में बात करते हैं, तो जैसे अक्सर हमसे कोई पूछता है कि भई आपका हाल कैसा है? तो हम गालिब को कोट कर देते हैं कि उनके देखे से जो आ जाती है मुँह पे रौनक, तो समझते हैं बीमार का हाल अच्छा है। तो इसी तरह जब हमने अपनी जो है कोई इमोशन का इज़हार करना होता है, हम गानों को कोट करते हैं। ख़ास तौर पे बॉलीवुड सिनेमा को कोट करते हैं, डायलॉग्स को कोट करते हैं। तो मैंने झट से जो है इस ऑफ़र को कबूल कर लिया और मैंने कहा कि मैं इसको करूँगी। उन्होंने मुझे सावधान किया कि देख लो लड़की, 650 सपात हैं, कर लोगी? तो मैंने कहा कर लूँगी। अब जब मैंने पहला बाब पढ़ा तो उसकी रीडेबिलिटी इतनी ज़्यादा थी कि मैंने उसको पढ़ के साथ-साथ ट्रांसलेट करके दम लिया। अब जब मैंने इस बायोग्राफी को पढ़ा, इस आत्मकथा को पढ़ा, ये जीवनी एक जीवनी नहीं है, एक अहद का इतिहास है। ये सिर्फ़ शांताराम की कहानी नहीं है, ये शांताराम से मुंसलिक जो लोग हैं उनकी कहानी है, उनके दोस्तों की कहानी है, उनके उस्ताद की कहानी है। महाराष्ट्र फ़िल्म कंपनी की कहानी है, जहाँ-जहाँ उन्होंने सफ़र किया, जैसे लोग हैं, जैसे उनका मिज़ाज है, उनकी कहानी है। हमें इसमें जो है सिनेमा के परी चेहरे नज़र नहीं आते। हमें बैक स्टेज जो लोग काम कर रहे हैं, जो मेहनत कर रहे हैं, जो असल में कंट्रीब्यूट कर रहे हैं, जिनके बगैर ये स्टेज सजे ही ना, उनकी कहानी है। तो ये तजुर्बा जो है, मेरे लिए बहुत इम्पोर्टेंट था, क्योंकि इससे मुझे सिनेमा के हवाले से जो उसकी कठिनाइयाँ हैं, उसके बारे में जानने का मौका मिला। तो सबसे पहले ये मैं आपको इसके थोड़े बैकग्राउंड के बारे में बताती हूँ, इसके पस मंज़र के बारे में बताती हूँ। ये जो वी शांताराम हैं, उन्होंने ये अपनी ज़िंदगी की कथा अपनी बेटी को मराठी में बोलकर लिखवाई। बाद में उनकी बेटी जो है मुद्रा जसराज ने इसको मराठी में छपवाया, और फिर मोरेश्वर तपस्वी साहब ने इसका हिंदी में अनुवाद किया। अब अगर हम इसके नैरेटिव के बारे में देखें, इसके स्लूब के बारे में, इसके स्टाइल के बारे में, लिखने के अंदाज़ के बारे में देखें, तो हमें इसमें मराठी, हिंदी, संस्कृत, उर्दू और अंग्रेज़ी का मिलाप नज़र आता है। तो यूँ मल्टीलिंगुअल किस्म की ये तहरीर हम सब के लिए है। ये हमारी मुश्तरका जो है विरसे का एक हिस्सा है। तपस्वी साहब ने तो कोशिश की कि जब वो हिंदी में इसकी ट्रांसलेशन करें, तो मराठी के जो मुहावरा है, जो इडियम्स है, उसको जूँ का त्यों रखें। यही ख़याल मैंने भी उर्दू में अपनाया, क्योंकि हम अक्सर उर्दू के बारे में हम ये कहते हैं कि उर्दू इस कदर वसीह है, उसकी साख्त में इतनी लचक है कि वो किसी भी ज़ुबान के साख्त को, किसी लफ्ज़ को, किसी जुमले को अपने अंदर समो लेती है। इस ट्रांसलेशन के दौरान मैंने इस बात का भी अंदाजा लगाया कि सिर्फ उर्दू में नहीं, हिंदी में भी ये सलाहियत है कि वो अपने अंदर जो है चीजों को समो लेती है। और शायद यही वजह है कि इतने जमाने गुजरने के बाद भी जो कुछ अरसे बाद ये शोर उठता है कि अब हिंदी नहीं पढ़ी जा रही, उर्दू नहीं पढ़ी जा रही, उर्दू में लिखा नहीं जा रहा, हिंदी जो है छोड़ दी गई है। तो मुझे ये लगता है कि हत्ता कि अंग्रेजी के अल्फाज भी जब हम हिंदी उर्दू में डाल लेते हैं तो हम उसको चलाने का, उसको जारी रखने का बाइस बनते हैं। तो मैंने भी मुहावरों के साथ ज्यादा छेड़खानी नहीं की। जो शांताराम साहब ने फरमाया मैंने उसको उर्दू में ट्रांसलिटरेट करने की कोशिश की है। ये किताब क्योंकि हाईली रीडेबल है, तो इसलिए मुझे इसके तर्जुमा करते हुए मतलब किसी एक भी मुकाम पर मुझे नहीं लगा कि मुझे अब इसे छोड़ देना चाहिए, इसको आगे कंटिन्यू नहीं करना चाहिए, इसको जारी नहीं रखना चाहिए। क्योंकि जैसे-जैसे मैं इसको पढ़ती गई मुझ पे खुलता गया कि ये तो बरे-सगीर पाको हिंद की मुश्तरका तहज़ीब है। इसमें गंगा-जमुनी तहज़ीब की जो है अक्कासी नज़र आती है। तो ये जो हमारा कॉलोनियल पीरियड है, जिस तरह शांताराम ने अपने इर्द-गिर्द अंग्रेज़ों को काम करते देखा, फिर जो है उस अहद में डीकोलोनाइज़्ड होते देखा हमें, उन सब की झलकियाँ हमें इस बायोग्राफ़ी में, इस कथा में मिलती हैं। और साथ-साथ जो कुछ जैसे शांताराम जैसे जब प्रोड्यूसर और डायरेक्टर हों, तो वो ज़ाहिर-सी बात है सिनेमा के लिए वो काम करते हैं, जो कि हम आम लोगों से या आम जिनका काम होता है कि वो अर्न करें, बॉक्स ऑफिस पे हिट हों, उस तरह की तहलीकात के अलावा हम उनसे बहुत कुछ और सीख रहे होते हैं। अब यहाँ उनकी मैं कुछ मूवीज़ की बात करूँगी। अमर उन्होंने फेमिनिज़्म के हवाले से भी उन्होंने बहुत काम किया। अमर ज्योति उनकी फ़िल्म थी। इसी तरह हिंदू-मुस्लिम इत्तेहाद के बारे में उन्होंने अपनी पड़ोसी जो मूवी है, अपनी फ़िल्म उसमें काम किया। और हिंदू-मुस्लिम इत्तेहाद का दिखाया और एंटाई कॉलोनियल जो है फैक्टर्स को भी उन्होंने हाइलाइट किया। और शकुंतला बनाई, उसमें भी जो है जो औरत का तकद्दुस है, औरत का जो है अ, उसका अपर हैंड जो है उसको दिखाया। तो ये मैं समझती हूँ कि हिंदुस्तान और पाकिस्तान में जो फ़िल्म और टीवी है वो बहुत स्ट्रॉन्ग मीडियम है। हमारे यहाँ जो है किताब पढ़ने की उस तरह की रिवायत नहीं है कि हम इतनी किताबें लेके नहीं बैठते जिस तरह मगरिब में लेके बैठा जाता है। आप उनके सबवेज़ में देखें, उनके बस स्टैंड्स पे देखें, तो लोग अखबारात और किताबें पकड़े हुए होते हैं। लेकिन हमारे यहाँ ऐसा नहीं है। तो हमारे यहाँ फ़िल्म का जो मीडियम है वो इस लिहाज से बड़ा उम्दा और बड़ा स्ट्रॉन्ग है कि हम उसके ज़रिए अपनी बात पहुँचा सकते हैं और इस मीडियम का भरपूर इस्तेमाल जो है शांताराम साहब ने किया। और तवाइफ के मौज़ू को जो हमारे यहाँ एक टैबू समझा जाता है, उस पे भी उन्होंने बहुत बात की और उनकी जो मूवी थी आदमी, उसमें उन्होंने उसका असल मुकाम दिलाने की कोशिश की। तो जैसे अभी ख्वाजा अहमद अब्बास साहब की बात हो रही थी, तो उनके हवाले से मैं बताती चलूँ कि शांताराम साहब को जो है उन्होंने बताया कि डॉक्टर कोटनस की कहानी को आप जो है फ़िल्माएँ और ये वो कहानी है जिसमें अभी हम देखते हैं कि अभी इंटरनेशनल लेवल पे चाइना के पाकिस्तान के साथ और इंडिया के साथ क्या रिलेशनशिप है। तो इस रिलेशनशिप को उन्होंने अपनी मूवी का हिस्सा बनाया जो कि माज़ी में थी। अब जब मैं ये सारी बातें कर रही हूँ तो मुझे इस बात का ख़याल आता है कि जब मैं ये पढ़ रही थी तो मैं ये देख रही थी कि हमारा जो माशरा है जो शांतारामा में बताया गया है वो किस कदर प्लूरल माशरा है जिसमें हर एक की कंट्रीब्यूशन है, पार्टिसिपेशन है। अगर उनकी मूवी बम्बई में बैन होती है, महाराष्ट्र जो है हुकूमत उसको बैन करती है, तो उसको लाहौर में दिखाया जाता है, तो इस बात पे बड़ा खुश होते हैं। तो इस तरह के जो इवेंट्स हैं, वो जब वो कोट करते हैं, तो मुझे बड़ी खुशी होती है और मैं ये देखती हूँ कि इतने सालों में तरक्की करने के बाद हम इतने इज़म्स पे बात करते हैं, हम इतने नज़रियात पे बात करते हैं, लेकिन बेसिकली मैं ये देख रही हूँ कि हमारे यहाँ दिन-ब-दिन इनटॉलरेंस जो है, वो बढ़ती चली जा रही है। हम अपनी तरक्की में, अपने इल्म में बहुत आगे निकल गए हैं, लेकिन हम अपनी इक़दार में, अपनी रवायात में एक-दूसरे को टॉलरेट करने में, एक-दूसरे के साथ मिल-जुल के काम करने में बहुत पीछे रह गए हैं। तो ये देखने को मिलता है कि माज़ी में हम बहुत एक दूसरे से जुड़े हुए थे, इकट्ठे थे, जिसकी अभी भी हमें जुड़ने की, इकट्ठा होने की जरूरत है। इसलिए मुझे ये कॉन्फ्रेंस अटेंड करके सबकी बातें सुन के बहुत अच्छा लगा, क्योंकि जो चीज़ मैं शांतारामा में पढ़ रही थी वो मुझे देखने को मिली। और जब मैंने डॉक्टर साहिबा और डॉक्टर जो है सैयदा हमीद को और डॉक्टर सचिन को सुना, और इन्होंने जब कोट किया साउथ एशियन राइटर्स में जो हमारे मुश्तरका राइटर्स हैं, तो मुझे बड़ा अच्छा लगा ये सुनकर के हम अभी भी इनको रिगार्ड करते हैं, इनको सुनते हैं। तो इस अनुवाद को करते हुए जो कठिनाइयाँ पेश आई उसका तो मैं ज़िक्र नहीं करूँगी, क्योंकि टू ट्रांसलेट समथिंग इज़ अ हाईली रिस्पॉन्सिबल थिंग। इट रिक्वायर्स लॉट ऑफ रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी कि आपने जब एक ट्रांसलेटर ये कहता है कि मैं ट्रांसलेट कर रहा हूँ, तो वो इस बात का इकरार करता है, वो वचन देता है कि मैं आप तक सही बात पहुँचाने की कोशिश करूँगा। तो उन कठिनाइयों को मैं उसका जिक्र नहीं करूँगी, क्योंकि अजमल साहब जो है मेरा साथ देने के लिए थे, और भी बहुत सारे दोस्त थे जिन्होंने मेरा साथ दिया। तो मैं ये कहना चाहूँगी कि इस ट्रांसलेशन को मुकम्मल करने के बाद मतलब मैं बहैसियत इंसान अपने आप में तब्दीली महसूस करती हूँ। बहैसियत इंसान में देखती हूँ कि मुझे किस तरह सब लोगों के साथ मिलजुल के रहना है। हमारी क्या रवायात थी, क्या इक़दार थी, हम उनको भूल चुके हैं, उनको दोबारा से लेके आने की ज़रूरत है। अब कोल्हापुर का और शांतारामा का जो मेरा साथ है, वो 3.5 साल का है। मैंने बहुत लंबे अरसे में इसको कंप्लीट किया, इसको मुकम्मल किया, लेकिन इसकी बुनियादी वजह ये नहीं थी कि ये बहुत तवील एक किताब थी, जिसको मुझे मुकम्मल करना था। मैं दरमियान में बीमार भी हो गई, जिसकी वजह से मुझे इसको डिले करना पड़ा, लेकिन ये किताब सोते-जागते मेरे साथ रही। इस किताब का तर्जुमा मैं इस हवाले से भी अहम समझती हूँ, क्योंकि हमारे यहाँ बरे-सगीर में किताब की जो रवायत है वो इतनी ख़ास आगे नहीं बढ़ रही। लोग जो है नेटफ्लिक्स को देखना ज़्यादा पसंद करते हैं, बाकी स्ट्रीमिंग को देखना ज़्यादा पसंद करते हैं बजाए कि वो बैठें और किताब पढ़ें। और हमारे यहाँ अगर सिनेमा के हवाले से बात की जाए, वैसे तो हमारे यहाँ सिनेमा बहुत स्ट्रॉन्ग है। इसकी रवायत बॉलीवुड की रवायत, इंडियन सिनेमा की रवायत बहुत स्ट्रॉन्ग है। लेकिन इंडिया पाकिस्तान में और ख़ास तौर पे पाकिस्तान में इस पे लिखा गया लिटरेचर, इस पर की गई बहस और गुफ्तगू और डिस्कोर्सेज़ और नैरेटिव्स बहुत कम हैं। तो जब मैं इस किताब को देखती हूँ, तो मुझे ये किताब एक प्राइमरी सोर्स मालूम होती है। आइंदा अगर कोई रिसर्चर, कोई काम करने वाला इस पे काम करेगा, तो मुझे उम्मीद है कि इस किताब को सिनेमा के हवाले से ज़रूर कोट करेगा। इसमें जो प्रोड्यूसर, डायरेक्टर्स, मौसीकार, गाने वाले और तमाम कलाकार जिनका ज़िक्र किया गया है, जिस तरह टेक्नोलॉजी इंडिया में लाई गई है, जिस तरह इम्पोर्ट की गई है टेक्नोलॉजी, उसकी कठिनाइयों का ज़िक्र किया गया है। तो मुझे ये लगता है कि ये किताब जो है, चाहे इसका हिंदी अनुवाद हो या उर्दू अनुवाद हो, जब भी इंडियन सिनेमा पे काम किया जाएगा, तो इसको कोट ज़रूर किया जाएगा। जब भी पाकिस्तान में कोई इस पे काम करेगा, तो इसको ज़रूर कोट करेगा, क्योंकि शांताराम जो हैं वो हमारे मुश्तरका विरसा हैं। थैंक यू सो मच।
The session is open for discussions. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. We have two of our speakers with us. Saida ji has left probably. Hello.
We don't see any question written in chat box.
I'm afraid I don't have any competence to talk about theories of translation. So let me congratulate both the speakers who have, I mean, all three speakers actually, who have shared with us their experiences. and thank them. Thank you all. Thank you, Sachin.
Thank you.
Thank you, Farwa.
Uh,
Yes.
I think this is just a comment that I wanted to make. After listening to Saidaji's speech, I was reminded of the translations of all these people from Manto to Kuratul and Heather, and in Marathi, and they were done in the 60s, sometime in the 60s by Shripad Joshi, and I don't know, but the funniest part was that when Lihaf was translated into Marathi and published, Shripad Joshi had to face obscenity trial in the court. And again, I mean, things just don't change, because I remember that later, I mean, much later, I might be wrong in quoting, but there was a journal in Marathi, and they published again the translation of Lihaf sometime in 2011 or around that time. And I remember that the editor was flooded with letters which severely criticized the editorial policy of translating Lihaf into Marathi, and that too in a Diwali special issue. So some things just don't change, I feel. And I was, it's sad that Saidaji is not here, but I would definitely like to write something more about Mudassar of Hali, because this is something which is very important and people need to know about it. So I am not qualified to translate it into Marathi. My domain of translation is mainly English, Marathi, and Russian, obviously. But this is something which is very important, and maybe as a curtain raiser or something, we would like to give an introduction about it, or a critical essay about it in our journal, Kelani Bhashantar.
Great. So I think we will stop here.
Thank you for
okay, then yeah, I think we would then.
It was great to listen to you. Yeah, really.
Yeah,
thank you so
I
much.
was the youngest, and it shows the promising future of translation studies.
Yes, thank you so
and
much.
I'm sure she would be
Ma'am,
bridging
I
the.
want to add something. The case of exploding mangoes was published back in, I think, 2013, and it was all over in Pakistan and in the world. When it got translated in Urdu, it got banned. So there is a problem with establishment everywhere in South Asia. We have to tackle with it, unless we learn to accept the different narratives.
Yes. I think this is the time when we start coordinating with all the translators
Exactly.
in South Asia. I think let us take initiative in that.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot to all the participants, and I think this is a very good opportunity for Professor Ketkar also. If we can, in our own way, expand the scope of Bhasha to Bhasha translation, then there would be nothing like it actually. And we can have, if we can have a positive outcome in this fashion, then I would say that this colloquium would be successful in its aim. And I would sincerely like to thank Professor Navre for chairing the session, and all the three speakers. It was extremely interesting and very, very illuminating session.
Thank you.
And
Thank you
thanks
for having me.
organizing for arranging this wonderful colloquium, in which at least, I mean, really good participation, good presentation. And as a continuation of this, if we could come up with some concrete programs, I think that would be the success of the colloquium.
Yeah. Maybe create a kind of fora for translators in South Asia.
Yes.
This languages, including English.
Actually, we can even work